I usually sit here.
They usually use the space in between?
Yeah, I think so.
That's where I usually sit here. I think so, yeah.
What? You usually sit here. Not that I
usually sit here.
not that
Is there
you shouldn't
just a
sit here.
space between every time?
I think sometimes, yeah, it changes. But then they're very consistent.
Yes. I'm gonna sit right here. That's so weird.
How's everybody's week before Thanksgiving going? Lots of work to do. Preparing the day before Thanksgiving. Doing Thanksgiving plans? All of my family and my wife's family are in Southern California, so we'll just be visiting all of them. Spend like a day or two before Thanksgiving with my parents, and then split Thanksgiving, and then the rest of the weekend with their parents. Who's traveling the farthest for Thanksgiving? Florida? Okay. Candidate? New York. Probably a little bit further. What's going on? What's the longest flight? What's your destination? Much longer. Is the cafeteria and stuff here even open over like Thanksgiving? Yes, that sounds great. Thank you. People who are staying here to make you figure it out yourself. Does anybody have anything exciting for Thanksgiving other than eating turkey?
I'm going camping.
Camping? Where?
Joshua.
Okay. A fun place. I grew up around here, and so we go to Joshua Tree and go rock climbing there a lot growing up when I was.
I've never been.
It's kind of I don't know. I always thought it was like one of the weirdest deserts that I've been to, just because there's just these giant boulders that are like 100 feet high, just kind of scattered around in different places. Then, so there's the Pacific Crest Trail, starts in Mexico, goes up to Canada. Been hiking it in sort of pieces with my dad, and one of the coolest parts that we've done, I thought, was right after Joshua Tree, where there's giant cactuses and giant pine trees all mixed together. I hadn't seen anything like that before. Okay, so this is our official start today of CS 40. Is our last lecture style class before Thanksgiving. We're going to be talking about totally different material today. So we're going to be moving on to this thing called SQL or SQL. And in particular, today we're going to go over your quiz next, I guess not next week, but 2 weeks from now. What your post-Thanksgiving quiz on SQL will look like. And yeah, so up front, if you don't have them, there's 2 sheets of paper related to the quiz that we'll be going over today. For doing that, I just wanted to do a highlight of sort of what's left in this course so that you can be aware of all that with your scheduling things out and knowing how much time to allocate to different things. So the first thing is all of your grades as of this morning are totally updated. And so you can know where you're standing and what you need to get on the upcoming assignments. So the exceptions quiz, pretty good, 80% average, maintaining our like 93-ish class average overall. The total number of points that you have in this class so far is 190, and depending on your like exact situation, that might be a little bit less than you for you if you were excused maybe from one of the quizzes, but that's what the standard total points is. And there's currently 115 points that remain, so about a little more than a third of your grade. And this is the breakdown of it. So 35 points basically for this Reddit assignment. And then we have 2 quizzes left. So this SQL quiz, and then there's going to be a just a last quiz that sort of covers everything. So this is currently this quiz is scheduled. It'll be on the last week of classes. If people are like lots of people tell me you don't want to do the last quiz, so I'm open to the idea of canceling it. So
I'm not into the last. Just, you know, if you want some.
Then the main thing that's going to be your the last part of your grade is the final homework assignment. And again, the idea of this homework assignment is that so far everything that we've been doing, almost everything that we've been doing has been like interacting with somebody else's web page, like scraping their web page, or with our Reddit bot posting information to their web page. This last assignment is going to be sort of the opposite end of that, having your own web page that other people might interact with. And we'll basically be cloning Twitter, but again, it's the same basic idea for Facebook, Reddit, Instagram, any of these web pages. They're all basically the same under the hood with just some slight different decorations. Or at least from a technical perspective, they're the same. And then the labs that we'll have next week are going to be very closely related to the homework assignment, designed to just give you sort of stepping stones on the homework assignment, similar to how the labs for the Reddit assignment were sort of geared to be like just initial parts of the homework assignments. Okay.
Do you need for to say homework 5? We're doing homework 4 right
Yeah, I think I probably can't count. So this one should be homework 4, and this one should be homework 5. Yeah, right. And then, so all of this stuff would be happening the before finals week, pre-finals week, and then your very last homework assignment, the due date for it will be the during the finals time for this class, which happens to be the last day of finals. So you have all finals week to work on it. The way that you'll submit that homework, and we'll go over it, like the details of this later, but it's basically going to be demoing on Zoom, so you don't have to be around in person to do it. So if you wanted to finish early and leave early, then that's totally okay.
When are you doing the Zoom demo?
So it'll be during the finals block for this class. But yeah, so basically what that's going to look like is everybody will have a 5-minute block that you'll just log into Zoom with me, demo all of the cool things about your web page, and I'll tell you right then what your grade is. The grades, like actual grades in this class, are due the 23rd. So if for whatever reason you couldn't finish this in time, you'd have a late chance of demoing on Monday of the next week, and that would only be considered a single day late if you wanted to have that additional weekend to work on things. Okay. Yeah, so I missed up my numbers here. All of these numbers should have 1 added to them. That's 4, 5, and 5.
Just the ratio.
Good. And then one last reminder is you do have the either required reading or required viewing to do for this class. And make sure that you get that done before, so the actual due date of that is also going to be on the last, the finals day. Basically everything for a class is supposed to be due by this December 19th time. My recommendation is to just watch some stuff over Thanksgiving. That's a good time to try to get those things done. Any questions about anything like admin wise for the remainder of this course?
It's totally clear. Me, so like my flight home is on the 17th. I'm good to demo all my Python or all my Twitter stuff.
Yep, 100% okay if you do the demo remotely. Yeah, so part of the motivation for doing it on Zoom is to give you that flexibility. Another part of the motivation is since I can only meet with one person at a time, there's no point in having 30 people sitting around waiting as I in person as I just look at one person's computer. So it worked pretty well on Zoom last year demoing this project, and I'll just keep that format. Let's see. One sort of maybe piece of advice is that well, yeah. So if you're not happy with your current grade for whatever reason, there's lots of extra credits again on this Reddit assignment. But this homework 5, the Twitter assignment, if we haven't gone over yet, has even more extra credits and had above a 200% on this particular assignment. So people really putting in like good effort on this assignment. And no matter what your current grade is, I'm happy if you are putting in that much work and doing a really awesome thing on this assignment right here. You can definitely get into the A range if you put that work in. That said, one of the things that tends to happen or has happened to a couple of students is that maybe if your grade is already like really high, you think that, oh, I only need a whatever percent on this last homework assignment or this Reddit assignment. And so you put it off a lot, and then you realize the assignments are bigger than you thought they were, and you don't get that whatever percent that you needed to get your whatever grade that you're trying to get. So don't put them off. Any questions about anything upcoming in the course? Oh, sorry.
For homework 4, I don't know if you went over this, but it says like in order to earn full credit, you have to do some of the optional ones, but under the optional ones, it also like marks it as extra credit. How does that like?
Yeah, so the question is on homework for the Reddit assignment. The way the grading is going to work is, so here's our grading rubric. It's out of 30 points total. If you do these required tasks, then that gets you the 20 points. And then everything down here under the optional tasks starts adding on to the 20 points. So if you do the required things plus this one here, you get 22 points. If you do it plus these 5 things here, that's 30 out of 30. And then everything additional on top of that is above 30 points. So yeah, it's a little bit maybe different than how a lot of other assignments, especially in other classes, maybe get graded. But I wanted to give you all the freedom, both on this assignment and the next one, to pick things that like seem interesting to you and do the tasks that are the most fun.
Does this do number or does it?
Okay, so for this assignment, the only thing that you have to submit is on, where is it? The only thing that you have to submit is at this point right here, the 28th of November. And again, that is a hard deadline. Doesn't matter like what happens, Mexico could invade, that is still the deadline. Doesn't matter. My recommendation though is you finish everything by this time so that you have time to have your program running and generating lots of messages. And even if you think you have everything finished by this time, there might be some small changes that you need to make as it's running for hours and hours. You realize that, oh, there was this slight bug, and so I'll make this slight tweak, and then let it run for a little bit more.
If we submit it by this Sunday, will it have time to get the 1,000 comments optional task?
I think it would be very unlikely for you to be able to get the 1,000 comments by this Sunday. Not impossible, but you basically have to have everything pretty much start like today.
Like if we turn it in by November, by the 21st, by the 28th, will it have produced 1,000 comments?
If you finish it by this time,
yeah.
If you finish it by this time and everything's correct, you're guaranteed to have the 1,000 correct comments by this time. It takes typically about like 2 to 3 days of full-time bot running to generate the 1,000 correct comments. But you don't want to actually submit it until you have that stuff. Good questions. Any other questions about anything? Okay, and today, again, we're going on to our new material. Let's see, so first, just a cultural pronunciation thing, SQLLite sort of thing. That so this SQL or SQL it's a whole separate programming language, not related to Python, and there's 2 common ways to pronounce it: either SQL, like saying the letters, or just saying it really fast, like sequel. So like the sequel to a movie. And I pronounce it sequel. So anytime you hear me say sequel, I'm referring to this thing SQL. And if you read like this Dilbert's joke right here, you can see the pointy-haired boss says, "I think we should build an SQL database." And I know the pointy-haired boss is pronouncing this like SQL and not SQL because it's "and" right here. So "an SQL" or "a SQL." And so if you're the sort of person who wants to be the pointy-haired boss when you grow up, graduate, get a job, then SQL is the way that like the pointy-haired boss sort of people pronounce this language. And if you're the sort of person who wants to be Dilbert, then SQL is the way the pointy-haired boss sort of people management pronounces this. SQL is the way that engineers pronounce this. So I can tell, like, I don't know, just from how people pronounce things, what sort of background they have on this language. And there's no wrong choice. That's just a thing. So I mentioned SQL is its own separate programming language. And so let's real quickly review the types of programming languages that we've seen so far. So the ones we started with are markup languages. And so that's like HTML, CSS, and Markdown. Markdown being like the simplest sort of markup language. And the basic idea is that these languages tell the computer what to display. And then somehow the computer figures out how to do it. When you're writing HTML, CSS, you're not doing any sort of how step. There's no step-by-step procedures anywhere. And Python is very different than that. It is a procedural language because you must specifically specify the procedure to complete a task. So you specify the how, and then you work for any task, not just displaying. SQL sort of sits somewhere between these 2 languages. It's a declarative language, and so you tell the computer what to do, but in this case, it's what to compute rather than what to display. And then the computer will automatically figure out for us how to do those computations. In this class, we're not going to get into too much of the advanced SQL. This is really just like a get you some exposure sort of idea. But this SQL language is really the most important language for data scientists to know. So every course, every computer science course in the data science major somehow incorporates this SQL language inside of it. The reason why this is an important language is that so every interactive web page on the internet uses a SQL database to store the user content. So GitHub here, you all have user accounts on GitHub. That user account information is stored in a SQL database. Google, all of the information on Google is stored in a database. Facebook, it's all stored in a database. All these big websites, all stored in databases. Even very small websites, like if you have your own little personal WordPress blog that you post things to, it's all under the hood, a SQL database that's storing all of that. So that's maybe real world why SQL is important. More practical is that when you go to graduate and you're interviewing at any company as a data scientist position, they're guaranteed to ask you some technical SQL questions of how do you accomplish a certain task. And they'll hire you or not hire you based on your ability to answer those problems. So again, in this class, we won't be covering like all the super advanced SQL stuff. The later classes talk more about advanced SQL, how you can use SQL in more advanced ways. So this is the foundations of computer science class. So follow along to this class, and then this is the big data class, which is the follow on to that. And so instead, really what we're going to be focusing on is like the why should I care about SQL? So how to connect SQL and Python so that you can write some stuff in SQL and then get access to the results in Python. So starting next week, that's what we're going to be focusing on is like the connecting of the SQL to the Python. And then that'll be the back end of this Twitter program that you'll all be writing. Before we get to that connection though, connecting those two things together, we'll just cover some really basic SQL commands. So it'll be these 5 links right here are the references that you'll want to look at. And eventually when we get into interacting with Python, this will be the reference that you'll want to look at. None of this stuff is covered in our Python textbook, the automate the boring stuff. Not covered there. One last thing to point out from this page right here is that recommended task for next lecture is to download this program called SQLLite onto your computer. That'll make following along with subsequent lectures a little bit easier. For this lecture though, we're not going to need that program. Instead, we're going to be using this website, SQLFiddle.com, to do everything with. And this SQLFiddle.com is like PythonTutor.com, but for SQL. So it'll give us a chance just to explore how SQL works before we combine it with Python. Okay, yeah, so that's where we'll be going next. Before we do that, any big picture questions about SQL or either what to expect or what it does? Okay, maybe one last thing. This SQLLite program is probably the most commonly used and distributed and reproduced program in the entire world. So there's like, you might think something like Windows is the most common software that's been distributed, but every computer has at most like one Windows installation on it. The SQLLite, most computers already, like all of your computers guarantee already have about 100 different versions of SQLLite on it. It'll be a little bit hard to access the ones that already exist, so installing a new one will make things easier. Every single program that you like use on your phone, whether it's an Android phone or an iPhone, they're all using SQLLite under the hood to store all of their information. So your phones probably also have hundreds of SQLLite installations on them. And this program is it's really unique in that there's actually only 3 people who are like the actual developers of this program. And so it has literally hundreds of billions, maybe trillions of installations all around the world. And it's just 3 people who have written all of this, and they've made it freely available for all of us to benefit from. They don't charge any money anytime somebody uses it. So it's sort of random people like that that make a lot of the software that we work with actually usable. And yeah, I don't even know what those people's names are. And I use it all the time. No, it's just so like Guido von Rossum is super famous, so everybody knows what his name is. These other people, they're just not, they don't hide their identity. We just go to SQLLite.org, we could go find it, but they don't advertise themselves like Guido does. So that's why I don't know their names.
What's the difference between SQL and SQLLite?
Oh yeah, so the question is, what exactly is the difference between SQL and SQLLite? There are many different versions of SQL. In this class, we're using SQLLite. It's the simplest, most popular one. In the subsequent class, the foundations class, we use a version of SQL called MySQL. And then in the big data class, we use a version of SQL called Postgres. They're basically all the same from like a user interface perspective, 99% the same. Just some of the advanced features are different between them. The real reason we're using this one is just because it's the easiest to install for this class. All the features that we're using would be also available on all the other ones.
I think it might be covered here, so I'll just save it.
Okay. Okay, so where we're going to go to next is this SQLFiddle.com. And I recommend that you pull up the webpage in order to be able to follow along with what we're doing. And I've also, so right here under week 11, these 2 files or 2 pages that I have up here, the page without a staple in it is this practice quiz _ schema. That's the one without a staple. Practice quiz _ problems. That's the one with a staple. And I'm going to click on the schema file. And this is all SQL code. We'll go into exactly what it's doing here in a little bit. But what I want to do first of all is just copy and paste this. Copy all of that into this SQL Fiddle environment over here so that we'll be able to play around with what it's doing. The next thing to do is up here on SQL Fiddle, there's a bunch of different versions of SQL that you can use. And so I mentioned these before, MySQL, Postgres, using those in other classes. We want the SQLLite, and the SQL.js is the one that I'm going to use, but it should be basically the same web SQL or SQL.js. I think this one's a little bit faster though. So that's what I'm going to select as the flavor or the dialect of SQL that I'm going to run. And then this blue button down here, build schema, press that, and all of those black boxes went away. And if everything works, then there should be no error messages. You should get this green box down here saying everything is ready.
Where's the content from? The file?
This content is from so under week 11, the file is practice quiz _ schema.sql, and you copy and paste that over to SQL Fiddle.
Thank you.
What was the JS?
Any other questions so far about just getting things set up?
Paste it and then press build schema. Does I have an error in my SQL?
If you're getting some sort of error message, the most likely thing is in the top left up here. You have the wrong thing selected. That we want the SQLLite SQL.js right here. Any other questions about the setup of how to get things set up? Yes.
My browser like isn't loading SQL. I don't know if anyone else is.
I have to Google it because
Yeah.
the link would not work.
Thank you.
Do I have a typo in the link, maybe? SQLFiddle.com is the place.
This is already in VS Code, right? Since it's like attached to Python, or do you have to import?
So the question is, how does this relate to VS Code? Python already has SQLLite built in. And so you won't have to download anything in order to work with SQLLite through Python. But this sort of interface of just working with SQL directly is not built into VS Code. But I do recommend before next class downloading this, following this link right here and downloading it, because that will let us do some stuff directly in SQL in VS Code. Got a question? Yes?
Like I was just wondering, like how is like a different programming language built in?
It's a great question. We'll see that next time. Okay, so now the left-hand pane over here is our setup, and then the right-hand pane over here is where we're going to run some SQL commands. And I'm going to start with just a very simple one, and then we'll walk through exactly what that command did and how it relates to the stuff over here on the left. And that command is select star from users semicolon. I like that. Press the run SQL. Have to be all capitalized. SQL is not case sensitive. You can capitalize it or not as you choose. So, I have a typo.
What are you supposed to get?
You're supposed to get a table looking thing as outputs.
Why did you say ID instead of star?
Because I just deleted it. The star that it should. Let's just delete that and take it down. Why are you not wanting to work? And other people, they're working for everyone else, but not for me. Yes, it's all, everything's reversed. It's backwards of what it's supposed to be. So I'm just changing some things to make it a little bit simpler over here. Okay, now it seems to not be complaining. Do whatever I did. Okay, there we go. I have no idea why it's why I was not wanting to work before, but it wasn't, and now it is. So, so now we're all happy. Yes, so this select command is sort of the most basic, the most fundamental command inside of SQL. And this command, all of these commands in SQL, they are case insensitive. Is this big enough for everybody? There we go, a little bit better. All of these commands are case insensitive. So whether I do lowercase select or uppercase select or do some sort of like crazy thing like that, doesn't matter. All that matters is that the letters are the right letters. And anytime you have a select statement, the output of this select statement is a table of some sort. So basically like an Excel spreadsheet down here. And in this case, so when you have select something from something else, this thing over here is called a table. So whatever is to the right of the from is called a table. Sometimes a table is also called a relation. So the users is a table or a relation. And table and relation are just synonyms of each other. They mean nothing different at all. But if you're looking through the references will use these two words interchangeably. The way this thing, was there a question?
Just for note taking purposes, do we have any offline alternative or?
Question is there any sort of offline alternative to this? And the answer is yes, that is that SQLLite program, that there's the download link in the next, right here, that this is an offline sort of thing of what we're looking at, and we'll be using that after this class, next class. So this is a command right here. This is the SQL command. And a comment in SQL is started with a dash dash. So like in Python, we use the hashtag as a comment. In SQL, we use the dash dash as a comment. And these tables or relations are defined with this create table statement up here. So I have a users over here, and this is where I created that table users. There's another table down here, create table messages. Notice that above I capitalized everything, down here it's all lowercase. But so messages is also a valid table that I can put right here. Messages, run the SQL, and there we go. Each of the columns of this table down here is one of the entries of this create table command up here. At the very first, let's see, we'll go over what all of these things here mean in a little bit, but the important one right now is this very first one in black. These things right here correspond to the actual like headers of the columns down here. So the messages has an ID, a sender ID, a message, a created at, and the users has ID, username, password, and age. If I type in something different down here, like username instead of users and run SQL, then I'll get an error message about something not being defined. This star right here, in general, in the vast majority of programming languages, star somehow means like everything. And so star here means get all of the columns. Get ID, username, password, and age. If I only wanted some of the columns, then I could say like get only the ID like this. Then I just have the IDs, or I could get just the ID and the age. And now it gives me just the ID and the age like this. Change this back to a star. And then, so this statement by itself isn't super interesting. What makes these select statements more interesting is you can add what's called a where clause. A where. And the where is kind of like an if statement in Python. So where, and then over here we have a condition that's going to evaluate true or false. And so I'll say where username equals Trump, like that. And run the SQL. And now we get, instead of getting all of the different, lots of different rows down here, we get only a single row of this Trump username row. Question?
What's the difference, or like, what are the pros of using SQL to do this versus running like a JSON or a CSV file?
Yeah, the question is, how exactly does this compare to other things that we've seen before, like JSON or CSV? And so you can see down here that like we're getting some output data, and this data would very naturally be stored in a JSON or CSV file. The advantage of using SQL is that eventually we're going to have not just a small number of users, but millions of users are going to sign up for your Twitter webpage, and millions of posts will be sent on your Twitter webpage. SQL is guaranteed to always process data in the most efficient way possible. So something like this, select star from users where username equals Trump. if your data was stored in a JSON file, you'd have to like load up the data, do a big for loop, looking over everything. And not only would that be like, well, it's a lot, this is just one line of code. The Python version with JSON would maybe be like 10 or 20 lines of code to open the file, to loop through it. And it would also be really, really slow. This turns out to, no matter how much data you have in this user table, it can happen instantaneously in microseconds. And how it does that, how it is so fast, is something that in the CS46 class, the data structures class, we talk about. There's a special thing called a B tree that's working under the hood that makes this super fast that you don't have access to inside of Python. But yeah, to reiterate the question was how exactly does this compare to things like JSON? And the answer is you can do all of the same stuff, but this is guaranteed to be a lot faster. That's the first main advantage of SQL. Good question. Any other questions so far? Okay. So here we have this condition in the where clause. And one of the things that's really confusing about SQL is that sometimes SQL is case sensitive. So inside of quotation marks, SQL is case sensitive. So if I change this uppercase T to a lowercase t and run the SQL command again, then you'll see that I get nothing. There's no table out here as a result because there are no actual usernames of lowercase trump. The only username that we have is uppercase trump like this. This sort of begs the question of like, how did data actually get into my table in the first place? So the select statement is accessing stuff from the table, and the create table over here defines what we call the schema of the table. It tells us what the columns are. And then with the select statement, we can somehow get that information, filter it out in certain ways, but how did it get there in the first place? And that's what these insert commands down here are doing. They're inserting data into this user table. This insert command, the way it looks like is insert into the name of the table, then a list of all of the columns you want to insert into. So username, password, and age, username, password, and age, and then a list of the values that go inside of there. So Trump, username, Trump, password, age 75. And so that's why over here, when I say username equals Trump in this condition, because we had this insert line right here, we have one row in the table that contains Trump, and this works. If we look at all of these inserts right here, there are no lowercase trumps, and so that's why when I do the lowercase trump over there, now it doesn't work.
The way to add content into a schema is just using the insert button.
That's correct. So yeah, the question is just the way to add comment. The way to add content is always with the insert command like this, and then this word schema refers only to the columns of the table and does not refer to the actual data inside of the table. So the word schema is the columns of the table, basically the create table command. And then data is what we would refer to as the the actual insertion for commands. It's a little bit confusing on this web page because it says build schema right here. So this stuff on the left is really primarily for the create table commands, and these insert commands could go on the right, but a create table command could not go on the right. Yeah, these words, I'm never going to ask you what the definitions are, but you'll just see these words being used throughout the references, and I'll be using them to mean these things in class. So this is, again, the users table. I've just added Trump and Biden, and then everyone in my family to the users table over here. And then we've all sent some messages on our Twitter phone. And here I've used a slightly different format of the insert command. All of these insert commands up here are inserting just a single message at a time, or a single user at a time, a single row at a time. Down here, we're inserting multiple rows at a time. So here we have sender ID, message, created at as the 3 columns that we're inserting into this messages table. And then these are all the different rows that I'm adding at once. There's absolutely no difference between doing these as 1 command versus 4 commands. It's just a little bit nicer this way, a little bit simpler.
What's the values thing you have at the end?
This right here? Yeah, so the question is, what exactly is this values doing? And this is just part of the command that it's always insert into the name of your table, then inside of parentheses, the columns that you're going to insert, and then the word values, and then the actual data that you want to insert. So the reason this values is here is just so that we know that the things to the left of the value are column names, and the things to the right are the actual rows, the actual data that we're trying to
For like the actual schema part, when you say like create table messages or whatever, you might have like not null or something. Is that just to specify what the actual like value is going to look like?
Yeah, so the question is, so we've talked about what this black leftmost text is on each row, but we haven't talked about any of this other stuff, and we'll get to that in a little bit. At this point, we haven't talked about this, so if it's confusing, then that's okay. There's a lot going on in SQL, and so things will all like fit together nicely by the end here, and hopefully make sense. But there's a lot of stuff that's maybe not obvious at first glance here. But good question. So yeah, actually, let's start talking about this stuff. So here, the next thing after the name of the column is the type of the column. So an ID is supposed to be an integer, the username and password is supposed to be text, and the age is supposed to be an integer. SQLLite actually doesn't enforce these things at all. So you can put a number inside of a username, or you can put a string inside of age, and SQLLite doesn't care. But other versions of SQL, like MySQL and Postgres, will actually enforce this, that like you have to have a number here and not just a string. Question is, what is unique? And we'll get to that in a little bit. So the next thing we'll talk about is what this not null means, not null. And in order to talk about that, let's take a look down here at these insert statements right here. I want to compare these 2 insert statements to each other. In this insert statement, you'll notice that I have username, password, and age. I'm adding all of the columns for myself. Me, here's my secure password, and I'm 35. But my wife would have gotten mad at me if I would have added her age to our Twitter account here. So there's no age listed over here. And so if we want to look at what actually got stored inside of this table, let's do a select star from users where username equals Kristen. Run SQL. And now here we have her ID, her username, her password, and then her age is listed as null. Anytime you don't have a entry that got inserted, this sort of default value of null gets inserted. And null is kind of like none in Python. You can explicitly insert null by changing it, just like typing it out like null like this, or just by not including anything, you get null inserted. What not null means, so by default, you're allowed to have null values in a table. So here, if we have a users table, maybe some users provide their age and some users don't provide their age. But every user must have a username and a password in order to be able to log into our web page. And so this not null means that you must provide a value there. If we were to, so let's build this schema. Over here on the right, change this to select star from users and insert into users. Let's do the username, password, values, Bob and Bob. Like this. Then here I'm inserting into the users table, providing both a username and a password. So there's not going to be a null value for those. And so when I run this command, there's no error message. And if we scroll down here, I can see that Bob has been added with username and password and a null age. But if we're to change this to not provide a password for Bob, just provide a username and run that SQL, then this is going to give me an error message because password right here has this not null. And so it means that anytime you run an insert command, it must have the password applied to it. That'll be more important when we get to interacting with Python. Then on your quiz, everything is guaranteed to be valid SQL, no error messages. So you don't need to worry about that yet. But that's what this not null means, is that in the table, every row must have a password.
So the unique, does that mean like usernames can't have the same people can't have the same username? Is that what that means?
And yeah, so then the question is, now what does this unique mean over here? And the answer is yes, that you can't have two people with the same username. So we already have somebody whose name is Trump. So we can, if we try to do username and password, somebody's trying to impersonate Trump on our Twitter clone and run that, then we're going to get an error message again because there's already a Trump inside of the username and the username is unique, so we can't duplicate it. But if I change this capital T to a lowercase t, run that, remember anything inside of quotation marks is not case sensitive. And so now we have a username capital Trump and a username lowercase Trump inside of here. Yeah.
Why does password show up in purple and the other like columns though?
Question is, why is password down here showing up in purple? And I don't know. Yeah. Not a good. Well, so technically, this password is it's a SQLLite function that we can do something else with in a different situation, but there's nothing special about it. Okay, so let's do. I guess one last thing that we should talk about. What does this primary key mean? Primary key means a couple of things. It means not null. It means unique, and it means automatically created. So the ID down here on all these entries, you can see it starts at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and so on. I've never added an ID on any of the inserts down here. It automatically added that for me. And common practice for every SQL table to have an ID integer primary key. Not required. And at this point, you don't necessarily need to know why that's a common practice, but you'll see this in all of the examples in the documentation, and both the users and the messages have this ID that's already automatically created.
Automatically. I missed the last part. It was automatically.
The columns automatically created, automatically given values. So in the inserts down here, I'm never inserting an ID, but the ID is never null in the results. That it starts at 1, then goes to 2, then 3. It just automatically puts in the next value every time you insert something.
Can you change the integer in that line to some kind of string value?
This right here?
Yeah.
Yes, I could, in which case it would then just be not null and unique and not automatically incrementing.
Is there a way to give it a command to automatically create a new string ID?
Yes, but that's something that nobody would ever want to do. Okay, So I think at this point, we've talked about everything inside of this file to the left. And, oh, actually, there's one last thing, maybe two last things that we need to talk about. So down here are the messages are providing a default value for the created at. But down here, I'm always providing a created at for my messages. I'm specifying the exact timestamp down here so that on a quiz, you would know exactly what the time is in each of these rows and each of these tables. But if I were to change this insert into messages, so my sender ID, this is the ID of the person who sent the message, and then what is the text of the message itself? Values. Person 4 sent this message and they said hi, like this. And I'm not providing a created at. You'll see that created at is not null, so it's we have to have something in there, but it has a default value of whatever the current timestamp is. So now when I run this command, look at the messages, come down to the bottom here, there's this hi, and it's just put in the current time right here. You might not think that this is the current time, but that is what the computer thinks is the current time. So technically, the UTC time is the time in London right now. So that's what the current timestamp is. The last thing that's weird in here is if we have something like this, these two quotation marks next to each other. This is in what we call escaping the quotation mark, so that we can say like I'm in SQL. Here we have like I'm a baby. Trump and Biden talking to each other, saying I'm a baby to each other. And in Python, we would have done like a backslash and then a quotation mark like this. This is how we would have done that in Python. But in SQL, it's a double quotation mark in order to include a quotation. And that's how SQL knows that it's not the end of the string, but just a quotation mark that you're adding. Question?
Yeah, so keep getting
Yeah, so the error messages on here are super uninformative. That it says type error for everything. Yeah, somewhere there's a typo. You can just, if you've been making changes over here to the left, everything that I have on the left right now should just be exactly what's from the quiz, so you can copy and paste it back to get to what we're going to work with. And from here, we're going to go to some of the problems from the practice quiz to see how these work. So on our practice quiz problems, I'm just going to copy and paste some of these over to our SQL Fiddle. And so here, problem 1, copy and paste it over here and run the SQL. And here we just get the output of 1. And so on the quiz, you would just put the number 1 down as the answer to this problem. And basically what this is testing is both that you know all of the syntax for the select statement right here, and that you're able to read through your this information over here on the left to understand what exactly is the information inside of the database. On your actual quiz, it'll be the same exact database, same exact users table, same exact information in the table. So you don't need to like look for any weird changes in that. The only things that will be different are the actual like problems and select statements.
So in SQL, if it's counting something, does it always start from 1 out of 0?
Great questions. The question is, here Trump is the very first thing that we inserted. Why is the ID 1 instead of 0? And the answer is that SQL is different than Python. SQL starts its primary keys at 1 and not at 0. And so if we did say like a select star from users, this shows us everything in the users table. And you can see that the IDs start at 1 and not at 0. And then, yeah, so the IDs automatically getting inserted. So Trump has ID 1, Biden 2, Evan 3, Isaac 4, Mike 5, Kristen 6. Okay, let's so we haven't talked about this like command over here. We've said that inside of the where clause you can have different conditions, but we haven't talked about the different things in this condition. So the first thing to highlight that we didn't actually highlight before, so where username equals Trump like this. In Python, when we have an if condition, we use the double equals. In SQL, we use the single equals, like a normal equal sign saying if username is equal to Trump. There's also this special like command that lets us search for patterns instead of just like exact equality. So there's nothing equivalent to this in Python, but this is super useful. So like is case insensitive. So I can do like lowercase Trump like this, run the command, and we get the ID of 1. I'm going to change this from ID to star so that we get the entire row, just to make it a little bit easier to see what the results are. On the quiz, I'm only ever asking for like 1 column at a time, just so you don't have to write out a whole bunch of stuff. Question?
So the like function basically just looks for anything that contains those characters, even if whether they're capitalized or not capitalized.
Exactly. So what we've seen so far with this like technically it's an operator because it sits between two things. So like equals is an operator, like is an operator. This like operator is just like equals, only it's case insensitive. Lowercase and uppercase doesn't matter. That's the first thing that like can do. The second thing that like can do is it can find more general patterns. So if we look at the practice quiz, a little bit farther down, we'll just skip to this. If you put a % sign in here, so if we do T%, this means that the string starts with a T and then has anything afterwards. % means anything at all. So if we run this SQL command, I don't know why I was giving an error message before, but the % means match anything that starts with a T and then has anything after. If I wanted to match anything with a T anywhere inside of it, then we can put a % at the beginning. And this says match anything, then match a T, then match anything else, ignoring case the whole time. So if we run this, now this also matches Kristen because Kristen has a T inside of it right here. The leftmost % matches the Chris, and the rightmost % matches the N. So again, there's nothing like this in Python that's easy to use that we've covered. You have to have your weird slicing and if statements to find things like this. Okay?
Can you do a case sensitive matching command like?
The question is, can you do case sensitive matching commands with like? And in the other versions of SQL, Postgres, and MySQL, the answer is yes. In SQLLite, I don't think so.
Yeah, so the 1 percentage symbol means that anything behind T. What does 2 mean?
So anytime there's a %, this means match anything. So it means match anything, then a T, then anything else. Here, down here, the first %, the leftmost %, the match anything corresponds to this KRIS. Then there's a T, then the rightmost % corresponds to this EEN. Under Trump, the leftmost % matches nothing because nothing is something, nothing is anything. The T matches this T, the rightmost % matches the row. Let's do a couple more examples of this. So what if I wanted to do so there's a number of words that have E's inside of them. So like Biden and Mike and Kristen. And notice that all of these also have an I. So there's like an I and then an E. An I and then an E. An I and then an E. I can match, so match anything, then find an I, then match anything else, then find an E, then match anything else. And this will match Biden and Mike and Kristen. Biden and Mike and Kristen. If I wanted it to be specifically like can't match anything else, can only match an E and then an N, run that, that'll exclude Mike, but it'll match Kristen and Biden. So getting familiar with this is just a matter of playing around with a bunch of different patterns to see what it is.
I'm still a little bit confused about what does the percentage symbol do at the end of it. And now,
So question is specifically with the percentage at the end, let's say we try to match like just the letter T like this. This does not match anything because even though Trump begins with the letter T, there's this whole rump at the end. Adding the percent right here gets that rump. And there's the Trump.
what about right in front of it?
And then so if we have Mike ends in E, run that. E by itself, there is nothing that is just E by itself, so that doesn't match anything. But if I put a percent in front, then that percent out front matches the MIK. Here, there's a lot of things that match something and then the letter E, something and then the letter E, but they don't end in E. In order to get it to end in E, I put that percent there like that, and now that'll match the Biden, Mike, and Kristen.
So put it in front of it, and find it means that as long as it appears somewhere, it is considered.
Exactly.
It is matched.
Yep. Before and after means that the thing in between can appear anywhere.
This question about the like function. So if you were to have like, then Trump, right, with all lowercase, would that like, if there was a username that said like vote and trumpet, for example, would that return?
So if there's no percent sign, then it must match exactly.
Well, it has to be exact.
So for this, like when you use like this string function, can you match it with like any sort of like int or like a list or something like that, or is it solely for
Like only works with strings. Yeah. So if you're comparing things that are not strings, then you use the equal sign. Like only works with strings. A very important data type that is not a string is the null data type. And so maybe we wanted to find all of the users who have not specified an age. Something like select everything from users where age is null. This will not work. If I run this, then I get nothing returned. Anytime you have an equals and then a null, then nothing will match. What you have to do is age is null. And then that'll match Kristen because age for Kristen is null. There's a bunch of these initial problems just with this where clause, different types of things on the where clause. And then the next set of problems go on to this new clause called order by. So selecting things in a particular order. So here when we do select star from users, if we don't have an order by, then SQL is allowed to give us the results in any order that it likes, whatever it thinks is most efficient for its particular scenario. And in this case, it happens to give us them in ID order like this. But I can also say order by, and then a name of a column. So it can order by age like this, run it. And now it orders by all of the ages, starting with the null and then going smallest to biggest. Null is basically always considered the smallest value that there would be. I can, so this would be, is equivalent to ordering by ascending. ASC stands for ascending. From that, you get the same thing. If you want it in reverse order, then order by age descending. The way this particular clause is going to come up in your Twitter homework is with all of these messages that people are posting. You're going to have to, on the main page of your website, display the most recent messages. So you'll be ordering by the created at descending from the most recent down to the oldest. Okay?
If you do order by a string value, will it be ASCII?
Yeah, the question is, how does order by work for strings? And for SQLLite, I honestly don't know. I know for all of the other ones, it is ASCII-betical. SQLLite is sometimes weird about that, doesn't follow the standards, so I'm not sure whether it's ASCII or alphabetical.
If we create that, so you mentioned descending, so do you mind like showing what it would be the example, because it's still a number.
So if we do select star from messages, order by created at descending from that. Then here we are, the most recent messages first, and then the older messages down here at the bottom.
So it understands like I thought it would do it by like number, but it understands time as well.
And so in this case, number ordering, it matches time ordering. Yeah. And alphabetical, numeric, time ordering all happen to be the same thing with how the time is formatted. So the next interesting thing about SQL is you can do a little bit of computation inside of SQL, and we're going to only see this a very, very small amount, but SQL is extremely powerful this way. But we're going to see this count function inside of SQL. Count lets you count. So if we wanted to know how many messages there are, then we do select count star from messages. Remember that if we do count, or sorry, if we do just select star from messages like this, this will give us all of the results. If we do count, wrap count around something, then it will count up how many rows there are and just return that as a number. So there are 10 rows. So you can already see that we've written a lot of for loops doing counting inside of Python, and hopefully at this point it's not too hard to do that, but it's still rather obnoxious to create a big for loop, and this is super, just one line of code to be really easy. We can also add our where clause, something like where ID equals 5, or where sender ID equals 5. So sender ID 5 would correspond to me. And so this is how many messages have I sent, has sender ID 5 sent. We sent 3 messages. There's a really easy way on your Twitter webpage, you'll be able to get counts of how many messages different people have sent. Another thing about these, so this is called an aggregate function because it's aggregating all of these rows together into one result. If we, before, the last thing that we did was I had the where sender ID over here. I can change this so that it has sender ID in this column list, like that, and get rid of this where clause. And now it will do that, give me the counts for everybody. One last group by sender ID. There we go. So here on the left, these are all of the different sender IDs, and on the right over here, the number of counts per sender ID. This is not something that you need for the quiz. This is just an example of like one line of SQL code can do cool computations for you.
you explain the group?
Yeah, so what's going on here is, so the counting, this is the aggregate function, counting how many times something happens. I replaced the where clause with this group by so that each row is a different sender ID, and then also displaying the sender ID right. And again, this is you don't need, so you need to know the count for the quiz. You do not need to know the group by. This is just an example of a cool computation that you can do with SQL.
Group by just like put everything, like put all the senders already in the group. Like just what does group by mean?
So group by means everything with the same sender IDs. We're counting all the things with the same sender ID. So here, sender ID 5 had 3 messages, sender ID 4 had 1 message, sender ID 3 had 2 messages. If the group by doesn't make sense, it's not on the quiz, you don't need it for any part of the assignment. This is just an example of a cool computation that you can do in one line of SQL that so this is like what your bot stats program sort of did, where you had different bots and you were trying to count how many messages they had sent, and you needed a big for loop to do that. Here we have just a single line of SQL that does that computation for us. Okay, the remaining problems, problem 12 and on, they start off with either a delete command or an update command, and then so they're modifying the table somehow, and then you have to adjust how your select happens based on that table modification. So here, the delete command, let me just copy and paste this. On that, so previously we were getting 10 as the total number of messages, but now we've deleted for messages where sender ID equals 1, and so there was one thing that matched this condition right here, so now there's only 9 messages. If we have whatever this condition over here is, it will delete every message, every row that satisfies this condition. So if I, for example, said delete from messages where true, it will delete everything. And now we have nothing down here. If on the quiz, one of the problems says this, where there's no where clause, and now that also deletes everything. You can say delete from messages where sender ID equals 5. We said before there were 3 messages with sender ID equals 5. So now when we count star like this, 10 minus 3 gives us the 7. So that's the delete statements. We're pretty much out of time, so let's go ahead and stop here. There's also the update clause that we'll have to talk about before your quiz. So the quiz is on Wednesday after Thanksgiving, and we'll use Monday as a quick refresher of all of this for the quiz material as well. So this is a good stopping point for us. Again, recommend downloading the SQLLite program to your computer for class after Thanksgiving. Right?